Hello and welcome back to the James Kennedy podcast. I hope you've all had a great week and enjoyed this glorious sunshine, also known as the advancing climate catastrophe. And hope you've all been able by now to check out last week's episode with Zara Hassan. It was one of my favorite episodes, man. She was absolutely amazing. There was nothing she doesn't know on that issue. We were talking about refugees, immigration and asylum law in the UK and why we've still got such a long way to go. The Nationality and Borders Bill, we covered the whole lot, man. Well, she did. I just stood there and listened. But it was one of my favorite episodes so far, and she was absolutely brilliant. She just covered that whole issue from every angle, inside and out. She left no stone unturned. So please go back and listen to that episode if you haven't yet. It's really, really important. Massive shout out to everybody for supporting the podcast so far, subscribing, liking, sharing, leaving ratings and reviews and all that jazz. And massive, massive thanks to everybody for throwing some change into the PayPal link as well. It really does mean a lot and helps me keep this podcast advert free because, you know, neither you nor I want to have to stop proceedings halfway through and have some cheesy advert kicking in, you know what I mean? So thanks to everybody for enabling me to keep this independent and keeping it free of adverts. The link for that again is paypal.com/paypal.me/JamesKennedyUK. Right, that's all the formalities out of the way. Let's get down to the fun stuff. Today, man, I have got a beast on the show. This guy is kick-ass. And the issue of the day today is drugs. We're going to be talking about the war on drugs, addiction, the penal system, and why our guest today believes that all drugs should be legalized. Now, before you throw your hands up in shock horror and think, okay, this episode isn't for me, this one really is for you. This is such an important issue that affects all of our lives in so many ways that we might not even realize. The issue of drugs connects to the issues of crime and public health, what kind of society we'd like to have, how we take care of our sick and our suffering. And I think we're long overdue a collective catch-up on whether our current approach to drug enforcement has actually been working. So this is a broad subject which is fascinating and interesting in so many different ways, and we have got an absolute Spartan to come on the show and speak with us about it today. Trust me, you're going to enjoy this one, so strap in, sit back, and enjoy the ride, man. Steve Rawls is a senior policy analyst at Transform, a charity that campaigns for a radical change to our country's drug policy, and it's a place where Steve has been working on this issue since 1998. Steve regularly appears on the mainstream TV and print news outlets, so we are privileged to have him on our humble show today, and I cannot wait to jump feet first into this issue with him. So Steve, thanks so much for being with us. How are you, man?
Pretty good, kind of hot, but other than that, I'm very well.
Yeah, we are recording this, we should say, on the Tuesday, so it's the second day of what is supposed to be the hottest day in the history of the world ever, is that right?
Yeah, something like that. It certainly feels like it.
It was red alert yesterday, and I went out to Cardiff yesterday, and the clubs were packed. You know, they told everybody, don't go to work, don't go on the trains, don't go anywhere. And it occurred to me that literally nothing will keep the British public out of the pubs, second to, like, you know, nuclear holocaust or something.
Well, I mean, we're a nation of drugophiles, whether they're legal or not. So,
and I love that segue. That was pretty slick. That was. So, you've cleverly steered us right into the issue of the chat today, which is, as I mentioned, the issue of drug regulation, drugs, addiction, the penal system, all that stuff. And you are the man to speak to on this issue. So I'm going to step aside, give you the microphone, and let you do your thing. So before we get started, could you give the listeners just a very brief overview of who you are and what it is that you do over at Transform?
Right. So Transform is we're a charity. We are based in the UK, but we work in the UK and internationally. We have been around for about nearly 25 years, and we do policy analysis around the efficacy of our drug laws and our drug policies. And we advocate for reform to those drug laws and policies to try and get better outcomes. And our analysis is very much the kind of war on drugs approach, the prohibitionist approach, whatever you want to call it, the sort of punitive paradigm, where it's essentially punitive enforcement-led approach to drugs, has not worked. The idea of that whole approach was to use drug law enforcement to deter people from using drugs. So you have criminal penalties for drug possession and use. And the idea being that would stop people using drugs. and you use enforcement directly against drug markets. So you use enforcement to attack supply and production, both within this country and in places like Colombia and Afghanistan, where cocaine and opiates like heroin come from.
Yeah.
And looked at historically, we've had that policy for more than 50 years now. The Misuse of Drugs Act, which is the central piece of drug legislation in the UK, has been around it was 50th anniversary last year, actually. And prohibition can actually be traced back further than that. But even if you look at it as a 50-year project, for a policy that was designed to deter use and to restrict availability on drugs, it's clearly been a staggering failure. For every one of those 50 years, drug use globally has been rising. Drug use in the UK is far higher than it was in 1971. I don't think that would surprise anyone. There's 25 times more people using heroin. There's 10 times more people using cannabis. We now have a whole raft of drugs that didn't even exist in 1971. MDMA use, ecstasy use went from zero effectively in about 1985 to several million people using it every weekend by the end of the 80s. So, as an approach to deter use or to prevent drug supply, it clearly doesn't work. Drugs are cheaper, purer, stronger, more available than ever before in the UK. So it on its own terms, it doesn't work. And we have been very clear in that critique. But it's worse than that. It's not that just it doesn't work. It actually is worse than that. It empowers organized crime groups across the world. It fuels crime and violence. It makes risky drugs even more risky than they already are, because people don't know how strong they are or whether they're actually what they're claimed to be. And they don't have any information on dosage and safety and harm reduction on the packaging. So, on every front, it's fueling crime, it's fueling health harms, and it doesn't work on its own terms, and it's fabulously expensive. So we're hosing billions of pounds into this policy response to get absolutely disastrous outcomes on pretty much any metric you could choose. So part of our work is making that critique, just saying, look, the war on drugs doesn't work, and it hasn't worked for generations. So we need to have a rethink. So that's part of the work, is the critique. The flip side of that is the vision. So, what would we do to replace, if prohibition doesn't work, what do we do instead? And the kind of logical corollary is that we need to have some kind of legally regulated market, because the option is essentially you either leave the market with organized crime groups and unregulated street dealers, or you bring it within the ambit of government and the state, and you let responsible public health agencies regulate the market in ways that can reduce the harm it causes both to people who use drugs and to the wider community. And the thinking there is not like drugs are great, let's legalize them. It's not a sort of pro-drugs position. Drugs are obviously risky, but it's a pragmatic position that deals with reality. And the reality is that millions of people in the UK and hundreds of millions of people around the world do choose to use drugs regardless of all the messages from government, regardless of the law, regardless of the risks they face. They're using them anyway. As policymakers, we've got to deal with that reality. So it's a reality-based policy, which is loads of people. There is a huge demand for drugs, and it will be met one way or another. So we then have a choice: do we leave it in the hands of organized crime groups, or do we responsibly regulate it? Because there's no third option in which that market disappears, or that demand for drugs somehow magically evaporates one morning. Demand for drugs exists, for better or worse, whether we like it or not. And we have a choice about how that demand is going to be met, whether it's responsible regulation from governments or whether it's organized crime groups and all the carnage and chaos we've seen over the last 50 years. So that's the essence of our position. Obviously, there's then a lot of detail work we've done in terms of developing what those models like. When we talk about legalized drugs, what do we mean? Is it different for different drugs? How do you regulate access? What products are we talking about? Where would the shops be?
Yeah.
How do you license them? And all of that kind of detail we've done for different drugs in different environments, and produced a range of books and leaflets and so on that are all freely available on our website. And we use those as the basis for our advocacy work, which, initially it was just working with, the public and through the media. But as the debate has progressed over the last 20 years, and the idea of legally regulating drug markets has moved from the kind of fringes into the mainstream, it's now started. It's now a thing that is actually happening around the world. So we're now working with governments in a kind of consultancy role. So we're not no longer just activists or advocates. We're actually consultants sitting down with governments and policymakers, actually designing legislation. So things have moved on. Clearly, there's a long way to go. Most of the activity's been around cannabis stuff, but it is going beyond that now as well. I'm sure we can talk about that.
That was amazing. Yeah, you've already given us so much there already as to clearly the current system doesn't work, and you've hinted at some of the solutions there as well, which we want to get into all of that. And I'm glad that you said that you were able to discuss with us some of the practicalities as to how a new model could actually look in reality. And I want to cover all this stuff, man. I want to really lay out the case here as to why this is just the model that you're going to be proposing is one that just makes much more sense. Because this is a difficult issue, man, because as soon as you, like, if you were to soundbite it, as they often do in the newspapers and things, if you said, hey, I want to legalize all drugs, immediately most people, and probably rightly so, are gonna pull back and say, well, hang on a second, drugs cause so much destruction and harm in people's lives and in society. Why would you recklessly just make these things legal? There should be boundaries and resistances in place to minimize that damage and the exposure to these things. But that is not... It's not as simple as that, as you've clearly laid out. And that is not the solution that you're proposing in such a simplistic form either, is it? What you're proposing, I think, will take the power out of the hands of these organized criminal cartels, which will obviously make a difference to the types of crimes that we see on our streets. And it will bring the victims of addiction and substance abuse closer to the public health aspect of treatment and rehabilitation and recovery, rather than just simple punishment, and then the cycle goes round and round.
Yeah, I mean, I think, James, a good just to help people think about it, because I think you're absolutely right. Instinctively, if you say something like we want to legalize drugs, and people in their minds, they associate drugs with all the chaos and harm and addiction and squalor and death, and people have been watching Breaking Bad and Narcos, and they've seen all those awful tabloid stories about sort of, addiction and death and young people dying at festivals and all these horrible things associated with drugs. They're like, why would you want to legalize that? And it's kind of, actually, it's because of all that that we need to have a different approach. All of those bad things are happening under the current policy. And the current policy is not only not stopping those things happening, it's making them worse and it's making them more likely. So it is harder to deal with what is essentially a public health and social policy issue. It's much harder to deal with it and get the help to the people who need it and address the issues of crime and criminality when we are, criminalizing the people we're trying to help and handing control of this multi-billion-pound global market to the worst possible people, i.e., your Pablo Escobars and your kind of your cartel gangsters. We are. What prohibition does, what the war on drugs does, it doesn't get rid of the drugs. It hands control to the worst possible people. Yeah. And like I say, it's not a pro-drug position. Drugs obviously are risky and are associated with a whole range of different health risks and health harms. But our point of view is that if you have a public health approach, it enables you to address those harms in a more constructive, positive way than criminalise all the people who are we're putting at risk. Most of whom, I should say, tend to be vulnerable people. I mean, people who tend to become dependent or addicted on drugs are usually people who have other issues going on in their lives, whether it's mental health problems or poverty or histories of abuse and other things. These are vulnerable people. The idea that we criminalise and stick them in jail is completely wrong-headed, and but it's also very expensive. Treatment and public health approaches are cheaper. So even from a completely cold economic pragmatic point of view, prohibition of the war on drugs is very expensive and it doesn't work and imposes costs on everybody. A public health approach is actually, aside from anything else, more sort of compassionate or sort of social justice arguments. It's good value for money. It delivers better outcomes for less cash.
Well, people always like to hear that one. So that's good. And also there are the social benefits as well. I mean, you don't need to necessarily know someone or be around someone that has a direct substance abuse issue or addiction. But the effects of the current system are felt by all of us through society. And it's very much a kind of, it can be a hidden hand, So I'm interested to know, is there anywhere around the world that we can look to as an example where this new model of complete legalization of drugs across the board has actually been trialed? And if so, does that give us any data as yet as to whether it was successful, what worked, what didn't work, or anything that we can learn from?
Okay, so the simple answer to that is no. No country or jurisdiction has legalized all drugs. But what we are seeing is a wave of cannabis legalization. So I guess, unsurprisingly, cannabis has been the first kind of crack in the sort of prohibitionist dam, if you like. It's not surprising. Cannabis is the most widely used of all the illegal drugs. It's associated with certain risks, particularly for younger people regularly using the stronger types of cannabis, particularly some mental health risks. But compared to most other drugs, it's actually relatively lower risk. And I don't want to be accused of sort of defending cannabis, but in relative terms, it's probably less risky than tobacco and alcohol, for example, which we're very familiar with in the legal sphere. And it's less risky than cocaine and heroin and most of those sorts of drugs. It has a different sort of cultural it occupies a slightly different cultural space in that it's not as threatening to the kind of people don't find it as threatening as some of those other drugs because it's less risky and because it's more kind of culturally familiar and it's more widely used. So unsurprisingly, cannabis has led the charge in terms of regulation, and we're seeing that happening all over the world now. So Uruguay was the first country to legalize cannabis back in 2012-13. At the same time, Colorado and Washington states in the US did it. And they've been followed by 18 states in the US now. So over a third of the entire US population is living in a legal cannabis jurisdiction, including California, which is the same size economy and population as the UK. Canada has legalized and regulated. A number of Caribbean countries, including Jamaica. Legalization's moving forward quite fast for cannabis in Colombia. And then we've seen some quite Mexico, a Supreme Court case, cannabis is legalized in Mexico, and they're still trying to thrash out exactly how it's going to work, but that has happened. South Africa, similarly, Thailand recently legalized cannabis. And now we've actually got this wave of cannabis legalization happening in Europe. So we've got Germany, Malta, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Switzerland, are all in the process, either have or in the process of establishing legal markets for adult use, for non-medical use of cannabis. So there is an accelerating trend of cannabis regulation, and I think that's a good thing in itself. There are lessons from that about how to do it well or how to do it less well when the UK gets there, or when other countries start to follow that trend. But it's also opening up space for the wider debate. People are kind of saying, well, if we're going to legalize cannabis, why don't we legalize magic mushrooms? Or why don't we legalize MDMA? Or why don't we legalize something else? So it's creating a bit of space for the wider debate, because people are seeing that, in these countries that have legalized cannabis, things have, there hasn't been the sort of cannabis apocalypse that some of the kind of doom mongers were predicting. And in most places, it's actually been, generally speaking, fairly successful in terms of health and criminal justice outcomes, in terms of, spending resources for police. They've got more time to go and do other things. Less people are being criminalized. The illegal market and the related problems are shrinking. And generally speaking, it's been a success. Now, it's easy if you want to go and find some damning statistics to kind of trawl through and cherry pick some bad stats and say, but what about this and this and this? Now, no policy is perfect. This is a very new area. Some things are always going to go wrong, but we move on and we learn and we evolve. But generally speaking, the outcomes have been good. And I think that fact has now created an environment where not only is cannabis regulation a much easier thing to discuss in the UK, because you can go, well, look, they've done it in California, they've done it in Canada, they've done it in blah, blah, blah. It's also creating space to say, well, what about these other drugs? Because the same arguments apply. I mean, yes, those other drugs are generally more risky, but the same arguments apply. People are using them whether we like it or not. People are using them anyway. Big, tough punitive enforcement isn't deterring use. It's just making things worse. Maybe a regulated market and a public health focus would reduce the harms, both to users and the wider community. So that debate is now moving and expanding both geographically and within the issue to other drugs. So we're in a kind of sort of golden age, I think, of the drug policy reform debate, where everything is kind of accelerating and ramping up.
Yeah, for sure. And has there been enough time yet to look at these places which have recently changed, their drug policy regarding cannabis? Has there been enough time to actually glean any information or data from those places with regards to, has there been an increase in usage, or has there been a drop in associated crimes or anything like that? Is there anything we can learn from it at this point?
Well, it is, like you say, it's fairly early doors. I mean, the first jurisdictions were legalizing cannabis sort of about 10 years ago. And often they would change the law and then they would take a couple of years to actually sort of open the first shops, because you have to build your regulatory infrastructure. You have to establish a kind of regulatory body. You have to sort of set up the licensing. It's actually quite a complicated technocratic sort of project. The first shops opened in Colorado in 2014. The first shops didn't open in Uruguay actually until 2017. Canada, it took about 2 years, opened about three or 4 years ago. So yes, we have some data, but and most of it looks pretty good. And I can talk about that, but we have to also acknowledge that we are still very much in the rollout phase.
Yeah.
Or in most jurisdictions, we're still kind of rolling out this regulatory legal market, and there is inevitably a period of transition where people transition from the illegal market into the new licensed legal market, because they may already have established dealers or growers or contacts, and those sort of legacy markets don't necessarily just disappear overnight.
Right.
So there is a transition period. So, for example, in Canada, after 1 year, about a third of the market had moved to legal supply. And now after 3 years, or over 3 years, now about 3.5 years, we're about 55, 56, 57% of the market is now legally regulated. Wow. I mean, that does leave over 40% is still illegal or unregulated. But my argument would be, look, there's a clear trajectory there. We're moving towards, it's moving in a positive direction.
Right.
And 60% legally regulated and taxed is better than 100% kind of gangster, as it were.
Damn right.
So there's progress. In terms of levels of use, it's a good question. It's the question that always comes up. Surely if you legalize drugs, more people will use them.
Yeah.
It's totally understandable risk. But if you actually look at what happens, I mean, because drugs are fairly easily available anyway. I mean, anyone who wants to get cannabis in the UK, it's just not that difficult. In fact, any drugs. I mean, you can get WhatsApp menus of drugs, and you just tap in your requests, and it'll be delivered on a moped.
Yeah.
Within half an hour, quicker than a pizza arriving. So it's not difficult to get drugs. The idea that drugs would suddenly become available if they were legal, and they're not available now, it's just a misconception. Drugs are freely available now, basically to anybody who wants them. Yes, there may be some minor inconveniences, but once you've, if you get an established dealer, which is not a very difficult thing to do, drugs become very, very easily available. And the illegal market, if nothing else, has shown it's incredibly good at getting drugs to people who want them because they're so profitable. There's money to be made there, and organized crime groups are nothing if not entrepreneurial, and they're very flexible, and they're very good business people. So I think that's the important first thing to challenge. It's not so much that if you legalize drugs, they would be more available. The difference would be we, the regulators, the policymakers, we would be in charge of that availability. So we would start to be able to do things that we do with alcohol and tobacco and pharmaceutical drugs, for example. So you could have age access controls. You could say, okay, you can only buy cannabis if you're over 18 or over 20 or over 21 or whatever it is we decided. You can say the cannabis shops can only be open here, and here, and they can't be near schools, or they can't be near playgrounds, or maybe they can't. It would be online retail only, for example. We would get to make these decisions.
Yeah.
You could determine opening hours. You could determine things like, are they allowed to market and advertise? And our answer to that would be no, they're not. Just like we banned alcohol, we banned tobacco advertising. and branding on packaging, we think that something like legal cannabis shouldn't be able to advertise and market as a sort of lifestyle, commodity.
Yeah.
And we don't want cannabis brands sponsoring football teams like we have with alcohol, and like we had with tobacco in the past.
Yeah.
We don't want cocaine brands sponsoring club nights and things, or festivals, or ecstasy brands. So you can just ban all those things. You just don't allow it. We've done that very successfully with tobacco. You don't see tobacco marketing or advertising anywhere. We don't allow pharmaceutical medicines to advertise to consumers. We can do these things, and we have done them. And you can learn from how we regulate lots of other things, lots of other risky products and activities. We actually regulate them pretty well, not necessarily as well as we might for certain things. I don't think, for example, we regulate alcohol particularly well.
No,
I wouldn't. Were I in charge, if you made me king of the world, I wouldn't be allowing the level of advertising and sponsorship for alcohol that we see, like sponsoring sports events and things. Like the Euros was sponsored by Heineken, I think, which is ridiculous. You're associating a dangerous, highly addictive drug that kills thousands of people and fuels all kinds of violence and social problems. You're allowing them to sponsor a major sports event that is watched by tens of millions of children, and I think that's absolutely ridiculous. Like Strongbow cider sponsored the British Olympic team in Rio. Strongbow cider. It's not even nice cider. Not even nice. If it had been nice cider, I might have been more accommodating. But seriously, you don't want that kind of thing to happen. So you put controls on our advertising and marketing. You put controls on who has access to the market. You could control the price and the packaging. You can insist that you can mandate that you would have health warnings and dosage information and harm reduction information would be on the packaging, like when you get over the counter drugs in a pharmacist. And in fact, you could have the sales model would be a bit more like a pharmacist, that the vendor who you'd buy it off would be a trained individual who could give you advice about dosage and safety and drug services and how to harm reduction. They would say, make sure you stay hydrated if you have this ecstasy pill, or don't mix this cocaine with alcohol and other stimulants, or don't XYZ. The kind of targeted health information that can genuinely reduce harm and reduce drug-related deaths could be mandated on the packaging of the drugs themselves, and it would be related to the dosage of the drugs, which you would know because it was a legal product, unlike a random pill or powder you buy in a nightclub or something. And the vendor would be like a pharmacist, trained to give you advice and guidance. And in that way, you don't eliminate the risks of drugs, because you never can. I mean, everything involves a certain degree of risk, but you can manage and reduce it. So we would get less drug-related deaths. We would have less dependency. And when people would get into problems with their drug use, and that, inevitably that is still going to happen to some degree, they wouldn't be scared of asking for help or going to drug services because they were afraid of, legal consequences, because these things wouldn't be crimes anymore, and they should never have been crimes. They're not illegal. You can argue that drug use is reckless or stupid or foolhardy or immoral even, but it's not a crime in the classic sense. You can do risky things as an individual, and as an adult, you can make consenting choices to participate in risky activities. And it's not a crime. You can have unsafe sex. You can eat unhealthy food. You can do dangerous sports. We don't criminalize those things. And sex is actually a good analogy. So, we don't criminalize having sex without condoms. We encourage people to use condoms to avoid sexually transmitted diseases and unwanted pregnancies. Yeah. Looking at young people and sex, we don't say to young people, well, some people do say you shouldn't be having sex. We've got to deal with reality that young people are going to have sex whether they like it or not. Yeah. And we encourage them to practice safe sex, and so they don't get pregnant and STDs and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
So it's a pragmatic point of view. I come back to it. We're trying to deal with reality and be pragmatic here.
Yeah. Be mature.
You can't get rid of drugs. Let's regulate them to try and make them safer for everybody.
It makes so much sense, man. Honestly, I mean, anybody listening to this now, even if they're of a completely opposing view, I'm sure they can see the sense and the logic of this. It just makes sense. I mean, you don't have to be a drug user yourself, or you don't have to be a liberal progressive or something like that. But this is just based on hard facts and practicality and a knowledge of what doesn't work for the intended aims and what clearly does. And it's just a much more mature, compassionate, practical, realistic and affordable approach to drug reform and drug regulation than the one that we've been currently dragging around for God knows how long.
Yeah, and I something I always say to people. People go, "Oh no, I don't agree with that. I'm anti-drug." I'm like, well, you can be completely anti-drug and still be in favour of drug law reform. It's the two things aren't incompatible. You can think drug use is stupid. You can think people shouldn't use drugs, particularly young people.
Matter. Yeah.
But still acknowledge that what we're doing at the moment doesn't work, and a more pragmatic approach, including ending criminalization of users and regulated markets, would be better. And you see, one of the things that I think people don't realize, and I mentioned the money thing earlier, but we spend a lot of money fighting the war on drugs. And you talk about billions here and there for different things, and there's a lot of debate given the economic situation we're in at the moment about where are we going to find the money to pay for the NHS or social care or education or all these things. But we're spending about $7 billion a year in this country fighting the war on drugs.
Wow.
And that is money that is delivering dismal outcomes. Yeah. So we spend about £7 million a year fighting the war on drugs, but that is creating billions more in costs in other areas. So drug-related health problems, drug-related addiction, drug-related death, drug-related crime. It places an enormous burden on all of society. And so we're spending money to create new costs and harm society. It makes no sense. And just a fraction of that 7 billion, if we put it into 7 billion we're spending on stuff that we know doesn't work, why don't we spend a small amount of that on stuff that we know does work? So things like effective treatment for people who have drug problems, effective drug education so people understand the risks and make more sensible choices. Investing in young people so that they have cool stuff to do, and they're less likely to get involved in problematic drug use in the first place. There's no mystery here. This is all, in the same way that the war on drugs is deeply unscientific and deeply, unevidence based. All the kind of public health interventions, treatment, harm reduction, prevention, education, those things, we know that they work. We know that they work, and there's good evidence. So let's spend our money on doing that instead of fighting this endless, futile war on drugs that just simply doesn't work. And it's not just it doesn't work here, it's never worked anywhere. Right. Even in countries where they execute people and you get like ridiculous life sentences or public flogging, like in Saudi Arabia, or you get executed or whipped in Singapore, and death penalty in China, and brutal enforcement regimes. Tens of thousands of people killed in the drug war in the Philippines just in the last few years alone. Extrajudicial murders. Just grim, horrible, full on. Not non-metaphorical war on drugs policies. They still have terrible drug problems. So, this whole idea that somehow if only we fought the drug war a bit harder, if we ramped up our punishments,
all disappear,
flogged a few more cannabis users, it would somehow all suddenly start. It wouldn't. There's countries that have gone super hardcore, and they still have massive, just as bad drug problem, arguably worse because of all the other things I say. It tends to make it worse. And of course, the people who end up being punished, and this is another really important point, it tends to be the more vulnerable or sort of socially and economically marginalized members of society. Right. So it tends to be people from socially deprived communities. It tends to be young people, women, LGBT people, black youth in particular. Famously, black youth in the UK are grotesquely overrepresented in the criminal justice system in terms of drug enforcement. Yeah. You're 10 times more likely to be stopped and searched if you're black in the UK. Yeah. And once you're arrested, you're 10 times more likely to get more punitive sanctions. So, it's not only, on top of all of those other harms and costs, it's fueling, it's a path, it's a particularly acute conduit for institutional racism,
right,
and disproportionate policing. So, I could go on about all the problems and harms forever, but that is a particularly acute one in the UK, particularly in urban, in the cities.
Dude, you are on fire today, man.
Yeah, sorry, I'm ranting.
You were riffing, dude. It's what you're doing. You're preaching, man. Jesus Christ, I'm loving it. I'm looking at my questions, and you were just smashing through them one at a time.
Okay. No, but I mean, pick me up on it. If I'm not being clear on anything, do pick me up on any of these things.
Man, not at all.
I do understand that it, particularly for people who haven't, come to this issue in any detail, it is quite counterintuitive. I do get that, and I do have these conversations a lot. And to say to people who are, who may have had, like, family members have problems with drugs, or they may have lost people to drugs, or they may have had drug problems themselves, to then say, I want to legalize that particular drug that caused that harm to you.
Yeah.
It can really, it's not surprising people push back against it. But when you try and explain it as dealing with reality, doing what we know works, and stopping doing what we know makes everything worse, people do generally kind of come round to it. Even for the more difficult, challenging ideas like regulating some of the more dangerous drugs. And I'm up for talking about that as well, what that means in practice, because I think that is to people kind of go, yeah, cannabis, I kind of get that, but are you mad? Cocaine, heroin, are you mad?
Yeah.
So I think it's might be worth having a little talk about what that would mean in practice as well.
Definitely. I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I did want to raise that with you at some point, because we've spoken about, recreational drug use, but I don't really think that is the problem, is it? I mean, people going out on the weekend and, dropping some ecstasy tablets, or, people, smoking a few joints in the night or whatever, or even people going out on the weekend and doing a few lines of cocaine or whatever. These are not the problems, are they? When it becomes a problem is when addiction and substance abuse starts wrecking people's lives and the lives of their families and society around them.
Yep.
So how do the harder substances, such as heroin and cocaine, and the much more addictive and destructive substances like that, factor into the new model that you're proposing?
Right. So I think it's a really good question, which I kind of queued you up for. What we're talking about when we talk about regulating drugs, we're not talking about all drugs being available in corner shops, or all drugs being available in the same form of regulated availability. So for the lower risk drugs like cannabis, it might be a bit more like alcohol and tobacco, where you'd have licensed vendors, like what we see now in places like Canada.
Yeah.
I don't like some of the more commercialized type cannabis retail models that you see in some US states, but essentially it would be a form of licensed retailing, a bit more like alcohol and tobacco.
Right.
We propose for sort of what you might call medium risk drugs, so drugs that are more likely to get people into problems, but don't necessarily, if they're used in more moderate ways. Things like ecstasy, cocaine, amphetamines, kind of the LSD, the kind of party drugs or festival drugs that you were talking about. Some people use them problematically, but more commonly they're used fairly infrequently and moderately. Right. We propose a kind of pharmacy model there. So it's kind of what I was talking about earlier, where you would have something a bit more like a pharmacy, where you would go in, it would be an over-the-counter retailing, and the person who was selling it to you would be a trained individual like a pharmacist, who would be trained to give you advice on health and dosage and harm reduction and safety and so on. And you would get a rationed amount for personal use of a drug in pharmaceutical packaging. There wouldn't be any marketing or promotions or sponsorship or anything like that. So it would be a fairly functional retail experience, a bit like buying painkillers in a pharmacist,
right,
in a pharmacy. Now, for the most dangerous drugs, things like injectable heroin, for example, I think it's actually useful to point to the fact that people in the UK can already be prescribed. So people who are dependent on heroin, or have had long histories of heroin use and have failed on substitute drugs like methadone, they can actually already be prescribed injectable heroin.
Yeah.
So that already happens in the UK. And it happens within a medical model, so it doesn't need legalization as such because it comes under medicine. So these drugs aren't illegal. Cocaine, heroin, ketamine, amphetamines, they're all legal medical drugs already. So there is already legal production of all of those drugs. So you would get pharmaceutical heroin. It's prescribed to people who have been long-term heroin users and have failed in other treatment models. And that is effectively your legal heroin model, and it already exists. We don't actually need to legalize heroin. It's already legal, and it's already given to certain dependent users. Now, there are different models. Some people historically would just get it as a takeaway drug and they could use it at home. There's what's known kind of as the Swiss model, where you would go to a kind of clinic, you drop into a clinic twice a day, and you use the heroin on site under medical supervision. So if you do have a problem, if you did have an overdose or you have a sort of some kind of adverse event, there'll be someone there to look after you. Now that is actually a model. Funnily enough, it's called the British system, and it's been present in the UK since the 1920s in the Wollaston Committee. We've been prescribing heroin for almost 100 years in this country. So that is not a new idea at all. And it has a very good evidence base for it, because if you're prescribed heroin, you're not using dirty heroin. You're using heroin of known strength and purity with clean needles. So immediately, you're not getting overdoses, you're not getting infections, you're not injecting weird drugs that you don't know what they are, and you're not getting HIV and hepatitis from sharing needles. So a lot of the health problems that are, in people's minds associated with heroin aren't actually anything to do with heroin. They're to do with using illegal heroin in illegal environments.
Got you.
So shooting up in a dirty back street with a dirty needle, using dirty drugs, it's inevitably going to be very, very risky. Whereas using pharmaceutical heroin under medical supervision is actually very, very safe.
Right.
So again, it's not the drug in this case. I'm not saying heroin isn't dangerous. It clearly is. It's very addictive, but a lot of the harms associated with it are because it's illegal and used in these kind of illegal environments. So as soon as you prescribe it, people stop dying. People stop transmitting HIV and hepatitis. People aren't using in the streets anymore. They're not leaving needles in playgrounds and on pavements and so on, which I know fully understandably upsets a lot of people. And crucially, because they're not having to raise loads of money to pay the overinflated price of illegal street heroin, they stop or they dramatically reduce their offending. So we know, for example, that people who use heroin and crack are responsible for a disproportionate amount of acquisitive property crime. So street robberies, burglary, shoplifting, and so on, basically to raise money to pay to fuel their habit.
Yeah.
If they get their heroin on prescription, it's not actually a particularly expensive drug to manufacture. It's only becomes really expensive through the profiteering of the illegal trade. If you give people those on prescriptions, they stop stealing stuff, or they stop committing crime or fraud or whatever it is to raise money to buy the heroin. Now, it's not every heroin user is committing offences, but they're disproportionate. They are responsible for disproportionate, as much as half of all kind of acquisitive property crime, according to some estimates. So, but when you prescribe them, they stop stealing stuff. So everybody benefits. The community benefits. We reduce street injecting and drug litter. We reduce acquisitive property crime. We reduce the health costs of dealing with HIV and hepatitis and overdoses and so on. And that model exists now. So we don't even need to regulate. We don't even need to legalize heroin. It's already legal, and that is already happening now in the UK. And I think it's very successful. It's multiple countries around the world do it, and it's been around for decades and decades. So there's a very strong evidence base for giving legal heroin free to people who are addicted to heroin. Even again, you can understand why you say something like that. It's incredibly counterintuitive. What are you talking? Why would you give people heroin? Are you mad? But then you look at the outcomes in terms of reduced death, improved health, reduced crime, reduced drug litter, reduced street injecting, improved community safety, reduced profits to organised crime groups, and it's all good. And also, crucially, once you've got those people through the door and you're in contact with them regularly, in many cases every day, they're then in contact with health professionals who can give them access to other services.
Right.
That they can help them with their housing, they can help them with their employment, they can get them counselling for their mental health problems. And actually, statistically, it's shown they're much more likely to then get into long-term recovery and rehabilitation. So, ironically, giving people free heroin is actually a very good way of getting them off heroin in the longer term, because you get them into contact with services. And when they're ready, because they've dealt with some of their other issues, they will then use those rehabilitation services. So, it's one of those, again, counterintuitive things. Give out free heroin, you actually have less people using heroin. And it's what they found in Switzerland. One of the things was that a lot of people who use heroin were user dealers. So they would sell heroin to fund their use.
Yeah.
And part of that was about recruiting new people. Now, once you take those people out of the loop, you no longer have these user dealers recruiting new users. And so you have a kind of aging population of heroin users, and you don't get this kind of inflow of younger users. So, since they started prescribing heroin in Switzerland, the number of people injecting heroin has gone right down. It's dropped by almost half. And so this is what I mean about it being counterintuitive.
Yeah.
You start prescribing heroin, less people use heroin, and people are like, what? That doesn't make sense. But it is true, and the data's all there. And just on that particular one, we don't even need to have a debate around legalizing it, because it's already legal and already happening in the UK.
That's amazing, man. I did not know that. Much to my shame, I should have. But it's things get lost, in amongst the noise of the spin and the misinformation and the arguing and the right-wing headlines. But that's actually a very enlightened and forward-thinking approach. And to think that we've been doing that for 100 years is pretty awesome, I think.
Yeah, well, and actually that same thinking is increasingly spreading to other drugs. So in the UK as well, we do also prescribe amphetamines to people who are dependent on amphetamines. And one of the things that people do is they will try and prescribe safer preparation. So if someone's injecting amphetamines, you would give them oral amphetamine pills instead. So you say, look, you can have the drug, but maybe have it in the safer preparation, because injecting is intrinsically more risky.
Yeah.
And there's their efforts, and sometimes you would give people substitute drugs. So if someone's using methamphetamine, you might say, well, look, try these amphetamine sulfate tablets, because they're a bit less potent and they're longer acting, and you'll be using it less frequently. You won't have that kind of roller coaster of rush and then a crash and then another rush and then a crash. And we do that with heroin as well. So a lot of people who are dependent on heroin get prescribed methadone, which is a sort of safer oral preparation. Yeah. So you stop them injecting. But some people it doesn't work for. Those are the people who tend to get prescribed injectable heroin. But the thinking is kind of spreading to other drugs. So people, including stimulant drugs and also things like benzodiazepines. Right. So people who are dependent on things like benzodiazepines like Valium, kind of downers like Valium.
Yeah.
You prescribe them a certain amount, controlled dose, and then you can, hopefully slowly wean them off it. But it stops them using street benzodiazepines, which are things like etazolam, these ones that aren't prescribed drugs, but are very potent and very dangerous and, unknown potency, but very, very cheap. You can get a great handful of these things for $5. You get like 20 of these pills for $5, and each one of them will knock you out for sort of 14 hours. The people who are getting really badly into benzodiazepines can be prescribed them, and people who are, misusing crack, smoking crack, for example, is there some way that they could be prescribed a substitute stimulant? So there's lots of different threads to the kind of harm reduction, safe supply prescribing route, but generally that's what we're talking about for the most risky drugs and drug preparations. You basically move it into more of a kind of supervised medical sphere rather than a more kind of conventional recreational retail model.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And exactly like you said, at that point, it becomes much more a conversation about how we treat people in our society who are substance addicted rather than punishing them. Yeah. It becomes a conversation about recovery, help, support, rehabilitation. And if they're getting their substances from a regulated, certified, professional, health practitioner as such, then they're already one step closer to the service that can actually give them the treatment and the help that they need to help them recover and rebuild their lives, rather than being forced out of society and into the wilderness to kind of, fend for themselves. And we all know how that ends.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the sort of catchphrases of the reform movement is support, don't punish.
Right.
That you offer support and you stop punishing people, because it's a carrot and stick argument, and unfortunately the stick just doesn't work. The stick tends to end up being used to beat people who are already damaged. People, you're just hurting them more. These are often vulnerable people with multiple other health and mental health histories of abuse and so on. These are people who need support. And the idea that you would then punish them or further marginalize them, or even worse, imprison them,
right?
Put damaged people with mental health problems in a cage for 23 hours a day, in a traumatic environment at prison. People talk about prison being a great place to get off drugs. I mean, that's just absolute rubbish. Absolute rubbish. It's a terrible place to get off drugs, because not only is it incredibly boring and traumatic, and drugs is probably the thing you would want in that kind of environment. If you fill up a prison with, people who are dependent on drugs and people who have a history of selling drugs, and then the prison is staffed by poorly paid, poorly motivated prison staff, don't be surprised that prisons are absolutely swimming with drugs.
Right.
And they are. I mean, everybody knows that, and the data bears that out. Drugs are absolutely full of prisons, partly because we fill them up with drug users and drug dealers. It's not surprising there's drugs in there.
Well, even if you were like a small-time user that just got caught up in a situation and ended up in prison, suddenly then you're connected to a much broader base of, peers and suppliers and whatever, and you can come back out even worse. I
mean, there was a shocking statistic, is that 14% of people who go into prison who don't have a drug dependency or drug addiction, they leave prison with one.
Wow.
So we're not only are we not curing, or not curing, only not addressing people's problematic use, we're fueling it. We're creating new populations of problematic drug users. Because, if you're stuck in a tiny 6x10 cell for 23 hours a day, and someone says, "Here, do you want some drugs?" It's like you would probably think about it, because you'd be so bored out of your mind, and unstimulated. And what would, So prison's just and it's shockingly expensive. It costs like £45,000 a year to put someone in prison. You could put someone up in the Ritz Hotel for less than that.
Jesus.
And think how much drug treatment and drug education and drug harm reduction you could fund with that 45 grand. And that person will come out of prison and be more likely to use drugs and more likely to reoffend, because they've got a criminal record and they carry around the stigma of a prison sentence with them.
Yeah.
It's really hard to get a job. It's really hard to get housing if you've got a criminal record.
Right.
So by criminalizing people and putting them in prison, we make problematic drug use and addiction and dependence and reoffending more likely, not less. It's just, it's staggeringly stupid. It's just bewildering to me after all this time to see that we still carry on doing it. And it's just that drugs seems to have got sucked into this populist law and order, tough on crime narrative. And seems like there's a bit of a bidding war between the Tories and the Labour Party members, who can be toughest on drugs. We're the party of law and order.
Yeah.
And drugs just get sucked into that in a way it should not be. It just shouldn't be there. It's a health issue. I mean, there's a bigger issue about sentencing in prisons more broadly, but really we should not be putting vulnerable people with drug dependencies in prison at all, ever. I mean, it's just the wrong place for them.
That makes so much sense.
Doesn't work. It's expensive and completely counterproductive. So yeah, all of these things. I think there's a growing awareness of all this, by the way. I think if you look at the polling and the opinion surveys, you can see a clear trend that, acknowledgement that the war on drugs doesn't work and is counterproductive is growing. That's sort of a majority, almost a consensus view now. Where there isn't a consensus is about what to do about that. So there is still this small pocket of kind of reactionary commentators who say what we need to do is fight the drug war harder, put longer sentences and more police and more busts and get really tough. And, there is still that viewpoint out there. But I think it's kind of shriveling away, because I think people see that that is part of the problem. It's not part of the solution.
Yeah. So is there a feel for, has there been any research done into the public mood on this issue?
Yeah, there has actually. I mean, there's periodic opinion polls. It's quite difficult to compare them because often the wording is slightly different.
Right.
But you can see support for decriminalisation. And when I say decriminalisation, I mean ending criminal sanctions for personal possession and use. So this is different from legalisation and regulation of markets. So this is just ending criminal sanctions for users. That enjoys majority support now. It kind of depends how you ask the question and how you frame it and what terminology you use. Because if you just say decriminalise drugs, people often think you're talking about legalising and regulating drug markets. We're not. With decriminalising drugs, it means ending criminal sanctions for people who use drugs. So if you're caught in possession, you could get a fine or a treatment assessment or something, but you won't get a criminal record. So it'd be dealt with more like a speeding offence or something.
Right.
And support for that, if you frame it in those terms, is actually a majority. So people get that criminalising users is kind of stupid and counterproductive. Support for legalising cannabis is routinely at or near 50% now. So we're approaching majority or have achieved majority support for legalising cannabis. And I think that's largely to do with the US and Canada and all these other countries that are doing it, in Germany and everywhere. People see that. And it's kind of normalised that debate and given it some kind of credibility and authority. So support for that's continued to grow. And in London, it's 63%. So in sort of in your more kind of metropolitan areas, I guess, where levels of cannabis use are higher or where people are maybe a bit more liberal, you see even higher levels of support. So we've got majority support for decriminalisation of users. We've got at or approaching or in some cases comfortably into majority support for legalising cannabis. And there's also a broad consensus the war on drugs doesn't work. So we are definitely getting there. But if you then say, should we legalise cocaine? Yes, no. You'll get about 15% for yes.
Right.
But if you said, if you say, should we legalise heroin? You get like 5%. Hardly anyone thinks it. But that's because people think you're talking about having it available in Sainsbury's. Whereas if you say, should people who have failed in other forms of treatment be able to access pharmaceutical grade heroin for use in a clinical setting under medical supervision? And if you frame it in those slightly more nuanced terms and talk about heroin prescribing, you do get support for it. You do get majority support for it. And so a lot of it is about how the questions are framed and how we talk about these things. If you just say legalize drugs and people don't really know what you're talking about, their misunderstandings and misconceptions will fill that void.
Got you.
And if people think you're talking about, crack vending machines in primary schools, obviously they're going to push back on it. But if you talk about, a tiered system of responsible regulation controlled by appropriate public health authorities, giving rationed amounts in unbranded packaging to responsible adults, people start to get it, and people start to, go, okay, I see that is preferable to, Pablo Escobar and Breaking Bad and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
So we're definitely making progress, and you can see that is reflected in things like Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London, had kind of a cannabis reform as part of his election platform, and he won. And he was up against, can't remember what the guy's name, the Tory guy. He was very much against that, and Sadiq Khan won it. And it for me, it was a sign of the changing times that for him, taking a cannabis reform position had become a political asset rather than a political liability.
Got you. Yeah.
So that, to me, that shows how the times are changing. And I think, it would be great if some politicians just showed leadership. If they actually made the case, made the argument, and some do. Fair play to the Green Party and the Lib Dems and some of the other smaller parties who've had pretty sensible positions on some of these issues for a long time. And they are showing that leadership, but we're not seeing it from Labour or the Conservative Party, even though there are, public support amongst MPs for legalisation, regulation of drugs in both parties. It's interesting, actually, that it's not drug law reform isn't the preserve of left or right in any way. There are supporters and opponents within Labour and within the Tories, and there are drug law reform party, Conservative Party drug law reform group. There's a Labour Party drug law reform group, a Lib Dem Party drug law reform group.
Right.
It hasn't seemed to have got sucked into that partisan politics or the kind of ugly culture wars crap that we tend to dominate so much political debate. And I'm very glad about that. I like the fact that it's cross-party, even though there are some dreadful reactionary right-wing types who support legalizing drugs. People like Guido Fawkes and Nigel Farage and Fabricant and Tom Harwood and Dellingpole. Some of these people who on almost every other issue I violently disagree.
Yeah.
And I think in many cases completely awful people, but they support legalizing drugs just the same way as people on the left and people in the centre and everywhere else. So it's a good thing about it that people can understand the arguments across the political spectrum.
Damn right. Well, I'm a member of the Green Party, so big up to the Greens. But it sounds like, socially and in terms of the collective consciousness on this, we are moving in a much more progressive direction.
Yeah.
But as always, the machinery of government is kind of like 100 years behind the rest of us. So are you confident and hopeful for the future, or are we still stuck in a political gridlock that isn't likely to move anytime soon?
Well, it's a tricky one. I mean, this government, I think many people in government, and certainly within the civil service and the Home Office and so on, and I deal with a lot of these people, they do understand the arguments. They understand the failings of the status quo. They've seen the evidence from other places around the world that some of these different types of reform and pragmatic public health-based responses deliver better outcomes. And they do get it. But I think many of them, particularly in the current government, and unfortunately the Labour opposition, who are sort of obviously in a kind of, I don't know, kind of bit of a law and order arms race with the Tories at the moment.
Yeah.
They're terrified of the political consequences. They're terrified that, in the context of, if you've been investing in these drug war narratives, about a war on drugs and drugs are bad and we must fight them, and they're terrified that in that context. That many of them have been investing in those narratives for decades. If you start to move away from them and start to talk about reform, you'll somehow be portrayed as weak or surrendering, waving the white flag in the war on drugs, and all the kind of narratives that politicians are very, very afraid of. That no politician wants to be portrayed as weak.
Yeah.
I don't think a reform position is weak at all. I think it's a sign of strength and confidence to do the right thing because you think it will work for your constituents and the people you represent. But they're afraid of the political consequences even when they understand the arguments intellectually.
Right.
But I think if you look, the fact that the polling is moving towards majority support for decriminalisation of cannabis, at least, has started to change that equation. And Sadiq Khan, as I said, it's quite a good example that he took a reform platform because the polling showed that it was popular in London. It would be great to have some leadership, but I think what we have to do really, in the absence of that leadership, we have to keep making the arguments until public opinion and media opinion and key opinion former voices and leading podcasts start to make that argument for us and change public opinion so that it becomes, reform, a pragmatic reform platform becomes a political asset rather than a political liability. And I think we are approaching that kind of tipping point now. I think, I don't think in this government, this is a very chaotic government and there's been COVID and Brexit and this government sort of collapsing around us. But, I think the next government hopefully will be more stable, whether it's a Labour, Tory or coalition or something else. And hopefully there will be more space once the kind of multiple crises of Brexit and COVID and cost of living hopefully have receded a bit. Almost any other subject, any other policy area has struggled to get struggle for oxygen in the last couple of years just because of all these crazy things that have been going on. But hopefully, when things settle down and people can look at where this public debate is up to and where the evidence base is pointing, I think we're at a sort of fork in the road, and we're about to make a turn for the better.
And so what can anybody listening to this now then that's been inspired by what you've said today, what can they do to get involved and help? Is it simply a matter of lobbying your MP, or is that really not enough?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing to do is to talk about it with your friends, with your families, with your professional networks. Just talk about it, educate yourself, do some reading. There's loads of great material on the Transform website. There's loads of other NGOs who do and civil society groups who do really good stuff on this and produce a range of literature and discussion documents and essays and blogs. It's pitched at all different levels. There is all the very technical academic stuff, but there's also just the more discursive, chatty material. Just educate yourself about the issue and about the options. And yes, absolutely, go and talk to your MPs or your local councillors or any of your local policymakers. We pay their wages. They are there to serve us. They work for us. We should never forget it with your MP. You pay their wages. And their job is to represent you in Parliament, and you have an absolute right to go and talk to them about whatever the hell you like. I would encourage you to talk to them about this issue, explain what it means to you, what you would like to see, explain the problems you see with the status quo, and explain some of the things that you'd like to see them looking at. And you don't have to be like a massive world expert on this. By all means, point them to some of the Transform resources. If you want to, you can ring up Transform and we can talk you through it. We can send you some literature. We can even potentially join you and come with you to visit your MP. So, engaging your policymakers is really, really important. I mean, there's lots of other things you can do. We have a range of different campaigning activities and advocacy activities. We're also a charity, so, financial support, donations, large or smaller, obviously also welcome. There's a bunch of projects, campaigning, advocacy stuff, and you can go and read about it on our website. And we're not the only organisation working in the space. Also, there are brilliant organisations like VoltFast and Release and Drug Science and Beckley Foundation and International Drug Policy Consortium, and that's just in the UK. Harm Reduction International Network of People Who Use Drugs. They all occupy slightly different spaces within the debate, but they're all very good, very active. So just get involved, read more, learn more, speak to your local policymakers, support the NGOs that are doing work that you think is cool, and use us as a resource. The Transform website, transformdrugs.org, it's there as a resource for you, to support you, building up your knowledge and expertise in these issues and supporting you in advocacy work with policymakers or your professional arena or anything else. So do use us as a resource.
That's absolutely amazing. And for anybody listening to that who does want to get involved, I'll be putting all of the links that Steve just mentioned into the podcast description text. Fantastic. So whether you get the podcast on YouTube or Spotify or Apple, look through the episode notes and you'll get the links there. I'll also give you guys a little reminder at the end as well, once we've let Steve go, as to where you can find out more about Steve and Transform and their amazing cause. But Steve, speaking of letting you go, before I do that, there was one thing I wanted to mention at some point, which is the global impact of this, because there's a victim in this that we haven't talked about yet, which is the supplier countries, the countries where these drugs are manufactured. Places such as Colombia and Afghanistan, where these drugs such as cocaine and heroin are produced under such horrific and barbaric slave conditions. I mean, if you want to talk about a sweatshop product, then it doesn't get worse than that, And not only are very, very poor people at the mercy of these disgraceful crimes cartels, but they're also the victim of our war on drugs. They're the ones that are getting sprayed from airplanes with, crop killing chemicals, by the American government, etc., whilst they're out there just trying to, earn their daily keep for fear of getting a hand cut off if they don't or something. It's pretty brutal out there. So how would that factor into the model that you've been talking about today, where if we had a fully legalized system in the West where consumption mostly takes place, what would the knock-on effect be then for the producer countries in the third world where these products actually come from?
Well, I'm really glad you asked that, James. It's a really good question. It's an incredibly important area of drug policy. I think it's very easy to have a very parochial view that that we need to sort out our drug policy to deal with crime and addiction and whatnot in the UK, and forget that a large amount of the drugs that are consumed do come from elsewhere around the world, and those areas are in many ways the problems that those areas face eclipse the problems that we face by a huge margin. So in Mexico, for example, drug war related violence is leading to more than 10,000 murders, violent deaths a month.
What?
A month.
Jesus.
Not a year, a month.
Christ.
And that's just one country. A particularly bad one on the front line of the war on drugs. And that's not just the UK. Obviously, most of the drugs that are going through Mexico are transiting into North America, or being produced in Mexico are going to North America. But the war on drugs is very much a non-metaphorical war in those countries. Places like Colombia, you have millions of people displaced. You have cartels dominating entire regions and undermining good governance and security and fueling violence and conflict, and civil wars and just total chaos. And places like Afghanistan, as you say, the opium economy has funded all kinds of militias and terrorist groups, and violence and instability and insecurity. And it's not just in the producer countries, it's in the transit countries as well. The drugs coming from Latin America to Europe, a lot of them transit through West Africa.
Right.
Places like Guinea-Bissau. And these are very weak state infrastructure, very vulnerable countries, economically vulnerable anyway. And they've been absolutely devastated by the illegal drug economy. So yes, absolutely. When we think about the harms of our drug policies, we have to think about the wider international impacts and how awful they are. We also need to think about those places when we come to the reform agenda, because what we don't want to do, because one of the things that I think it's important to point out is that those drug economies, it's not all Pablo Escobar people. Most of the people working in drug production and transit are poor people who have got very few economic options. So they're often displaced people, they're migrants, they're socially and economically marginalized people. And when we reform our drugs, we can't just ignore them and hang them out to dry. We have to find ways to build a kind of peace process, if you like, that has some kind of economic reconstruction in it. And we need to look at sustainable development for those communities and help those people who have use illegal drug markets as a sort of survival economy, a form of economic survival. We need to look after those people as well. So we have to have a kind of development dimension built into our drug law reform program, so that the millions of people who are involved in illegal drug production are not just abandoned, because they're not all Pablo Escobars. Many of them are poor, displaced, migrant, marginalized communities who deserve our attention as well. But I think you're absolutely right that the harms of the war on drugs impact on those places even more negatively than they do for us in the UK. And it's absolutely right that we think about them in terms of the harms of our current policy, but also in terms of we think about them when we get to the reform process as well.
Well, I think if the product that they're producing was a legal product and didn't have to come through these criminal networks, I think that would have a knock-on effect down to the whole chain, wouldn't it? Because it's only the same as what we do with chocolate or coffee or anything like that.
Occasionally I have that when I've been talking about the idea of a legal cocaine market. People say, ha ha ha, you want organic fair trade cocaine, do you? And I'm kind of like, yes, I do. What kind do you want? And so I'm like, if it's organic fair trade cocaine or chemically polluted, unfairly traded gangster cocaine, I think I'll take the first one, thanks. And the debate is happening. This debate is happening around the world. There is a bill in the Colombian Senate now, and it's something that we've been working on, being debated in the Colombian Senate, to have a legal coca leaf market. But all coca leaf is the leaf that cocaine is extracted from, but also to have a pilot legal cocaine market in Colombia. They are debating it. So it's not just a sort of fantasy anymore. These are ideas that are being debated in national legislations. So cocaine legalization is being proposed and debated in the Colombian Senate right now.
That's amazing.
And it may not pass in its current form, but it shows how far the debate's come, that it's, and how bad things are, that they've got to the point where that is actually seriously being debated in national governments around the world. So I think there's room for optimism. The debate is progressing. It feels like it's accelerating. I think people's understanding of the options and the costs of the status quo are increasing. I think civil society and organizations like Transform around the world have had a big role in that. But it's now moving from these kind of civil society advocacy. It's moving into mainstream politics now, and we are seeing it. And I think we will see those changes sooner than people think in the UK. And if you want to see them happening around the world, just take a look. We've got 5 or 6 EU countries are legalizing cannabis. They're debating MDMA legalization in the Netherlands. They're debating regulated cocaine markets in Colombia. They're debating, they've implemented legal psychedelic plant access in a number of US states. So it's not just happening with cannabis. It's going beyond that. And generally, all the outcomes are pretty good. You can scrape around and find some cherry pick some bad outcomes if you like. But on the whole, things are getting better where they're adopting these policies. And that can only bode well for the future as well.
Amen. And Steve, on that note, I promise I will let you go now. Mate, thank you so much. That was a brilliant chat. You answered everything that I was hoping to talk about and more. So thank you so much for giving us your time. Thanks for everything you've been doing. I can't believe you've been doing this since 1998 and you still got as much energy and fight in you as I'm guessing you did when you started. So that's amazing. And I'm sure that one day this is going to happen. So I'm sure that everybody listening to this is going to be fired up and want to get involved now. So thanks for rallying even more troops. And thanks for giving us all this info today, which we can go and check out and get involved with. So on that note, I promise I am now going to let you get out of the sweat box because, man, I'm melting as well.
No, thanks a lot, James. It's been a real pleasure. And if anyone wants to follow up, just check out the Transform website and feel free to contact me or the organization. And we can help you get stuck in.
You heard the man. Get on it, get over there, get stuck in, and let's make this happen. Okay, Steve, thanks again, brother. It's great to see you and best wishes with everything. And we'll catch you again really soon. Thank you, man.
Great. Cheers.
Jesus Christ, I was not expecting that. That dude literally knows everything on this issue, man. If you are still unconvinced after listening to that, then I don't know what's going to help you. Legalizing drugs, man, it seems to make sense whichever way you look at it. This is just a mature and practical, fact-based solution that benefits everybody and will make society better for all of us. And anything that takes power out of the hands of violent macho criminal gangs on our streets and the fields of Colombia, I'm all for that. Now you can hear the whizzing in the background. That is my computer having a literal meltdown because I am stuck indoors. I got the windows closed because of the noise. I want to keep the noise down for the recording and everything. I've been in here now for about 2 hours chatting to Steve and I am absolutely wringing of sweat. We're having the middle of a heat wave right now. They had a red warning yesterday. It's the highest temperature we've ever had on record in the history of the earth or something today. And here I am, both me and my computer are dying a smelly, sweaty, whizzing, loud whirring death right now. So I'm going to get out of here. You don't need me to riff and ramble now about what Steve's just said. The man just made the case clear. Get on it, get involved, get yourself over to transformdrugs.org, which is their website, and check out all of the amazing info and links they've got there. There's also a donate link because, as Steve said, they are a charity, so they rely on donations from kind folks such as yourself. So get involved in that, and they are on Twitter at transformdrugs, so you can follow them there for updates as well. I hope you've all been enjoying the beginnings of our forthcoming climate extinction, otherwise known as summertime. And I will see you guys next week for another episode. Make sure to subscribe, leave a rating, leave a review, leave your thoughts, leave your comments, call me some names, do whatever you got to do. And I will see you next week. Take care of yourselves. Love you loads. See you guys.